The 8th of December 1941. Gray over the water low light pushing through the papered windows. The room smells of varnish and wet wool. Hayashi stands over the grid pencil resting where fuel ladders meet sortie columns. He listens for silence between the key clicks, the calm code that makes numbers behave. A breath in fours. Another. The pencil begins its metronome on the map. Skin, tick, tick, tick. Each touch a mile stolen from the tanks, each stroke a promise that the plan will keep its shape. The wall clock hesitates, then advances. A telegrapher mutters his syllables, iron filings, through a felt pad. Hayashi adds one more figure to the column that governs the second wave's turnaround, and the room steadies with the decision. A perfect plan is a straight line drawn with a bone ruler. No pause, no wobble, no apology. He feels the oath he made to himself years ago, never recommend a halt. Once the geometry is true, settle like a brace against his ribs. A faint undertone leaks through the headphones on the table. Not code. Not the warm chatter of a familiar net. A hum with a body to it, like air pushing against sheet metal, like a machine room before the first bell. He tilts his head and the pencil stops. Static lifts, and the hum thickens by a degree the way a shipyard wakes. He moves the slider rule and plots a correction for crosswind. The columns line up. The elegant clockwork of crews arming parties, fuel carts, deck tractors. The first rhythm of the morning sits correctly on the paper. He breathes again, and the calm returns to his fingers. Across the room, Sato tunes his set, and the hum passes away, replaced by the crisp beads of code, the quiet of precision. The room accepts it like a cathedral, accepts a footfall. Another message arrives, inked clean on the pad. Reports from the raid settle into their boxes. Words without drama, distances with edges, time of takeoff, time of contact, time of return. Triumph, even when earned, looks like arithmetic on a page. He lifts the paper to the lamp and reads the totals, and the totals agree with the plan. One more breath in fours. Then the undertone returns closer, now fat with life. The telegrapher flinches, retunes, and catches a fragment that does not belong to them. A clipped voice, quick and indifferent, rides the carrier of the foreign net. Work starts at dawn. Cranes by the hundreds. Keep the line moving. The room holds still. The hum is not one machine, he thinks, but many. It has overlap. It has depth. He marks fuel for the afternoon possibility and feels the pencil hesitate. The oath presses harder against the ribs. The straight line on the paper begins to look thin, a blade suspended over a river. He hears the hum again in his head, not in the set row upon row of the same hull, taking the same shape under the same cranes, a pattern that no single strike can unteach. He draws the final arrow for the day's cycle, and the arrow looks small. Sato calls a time. The wall clock yields its next minute. Outside water slaps the key in 3 repeating notes. Inside the map is an instrument that still behaves, and the numbers do what they are told. Hayashi touches the edge of the overlay and feels the wax give under his thumb. He knows what they have built here, a masterpiece that depends on the hour. He knows what drifts in from the far coast, a metronome that belongs to the month. The first reports drift in on thin paper that curls at the corner where the ink dries. Tonnages, damage, notes, names he has learned to pronounce as if weight will fix them in place. For a stretch of minutes, the body behaves, pulse, even breath measured pencil, moving in lines that do not waver. The arithmetic nods back. Precision still answers when asked politely. Kuroda leans over the table and taps a thumbnail against the edge of a plotting rule. He does not look up when he says it. The old sneer carried forward from academy lectures. Crude, American, ships, floating barns with engines. The others laugh the way men laugh at a thing that flatters the room. Hayashi lets the line hang there and listens for the counter-argument inside his head. Nothing arrives but the low thread in the radio that keeps returning like groundswell. He lays a sheet of fresh graph across the board and brings the pencil to the axis. The first point marks yard output before the year. The second point lands after. The line between them climbs too quickly to be comfortable. He adds the third point for the far coast and pauses the heartbeat, registering a new tempo. The pencil makes a small sound against the wood when he lifts it, a tiny click that only his hands hear. He turns to the carriers. Hull designations repeat in a way battleships never did, a family of names cut to the same key. You can build many when you stop pretending each must be a cathedral. The numbers come in soft, almost embarrassed, and then they repeat in a rhythm that does not stop. Laid down last spring, sister laid down in summer, another in autumn light carriers borne by conversion, as if steel could change its mind overnight. He counts flight decks like steps on a ladder and feels the pulse couple to the climbing. Tens in train, a handful already out more behind them in the distance, an assembly line that has learned to speak naval. He seeks refuge in aircraft. Here surely craft holds. Edge-polished propeller blades. Cowls that fit like glove work. Gunnery that drills the same circle out of air. He pulls the output series for engines and frames, and the refuge collapses. Bars in a column reach up past his internal ceiling and keep going. The ratio on the page looks like a wall. If a man trades 1 for 1 and the wall makes 5 more in the same hour, the trade is poetry, not policy. He knows it without wanting to know it. Hands steady when he writes the figure for an elegant fighter's climb rate. A small tremor when he writes how many of those fighters the other side will mount this month. The room's air changes when the telegrapher retunes and catches another domestic dispatch from across the ocean. Not the words, but the attitude inside them. Work starts at dawn. Cranes in rows. Keep the line moving. He can see it without the photograph riveters in helmets like beetle shells trolleys, sliding the same propeller hub into the same housing under the same lights. He lifts his eyes and counts the breaths to quiet the heart. 4 in 4 held 4 out. The numbers do not obey breathing. He writes fuel on one line and converts it into minutes of flying. He writes oil on another and turns it into the hours an engine is permitted to live before it is exchanged. The American habit disgusted him when he first read it, replace before failure, because replacement is faster than diagnosis. It is a kind of laziness, he told himself, a vandalism of good workmanship. He draws a box around turnaround and builds a small clock inside it. The hands make one trip and then another. The clock looks fine until he adds a second clock beside it, then a third, then a page of clocks, then a wall of clocks. And the feeling that rises in the chest is not respect but a private sense of betrayal. Perfection promised that if you were faithful, time would wait. It does not wait. Kuroda returns to the crude ship's line like a comfortable coat. Look at their welds. Look at the way the decks flex. Listen to their coarse engines. Hayashi nods, because there is comfort in contempt, but the pencil keeps moving. He plots repair times from intercepted maintenance manuals and finds something colder than pride, a table that assumes failure as a given and converts it into hours. A mechanic swaps a module before lunch, signs his name, and the airframe returns to the line before a sermon can begin. He remembers the feel of an overhauled machine after a day of attention, the way it hums, the way it invites a hand to rest on it, and he feels suddenly foolish for loving that feeling. The pulse ticks once for each datum that contradicts his taste. He tries distribution, the old friend that saves precious instruments from foolish deployments. The Americans treat depots like reservoirs and spill from them wherever the fight warms. The line chief in his head speaks with that clipped indifference strip. One squadron to fix another, pull an engine here, to stand an extra aircraft there, because a machine that is flying is worth more than one that is perfect. It is not elegant. It is not beautiful. It is horribly alive. Sato prints another slip from the set and places it near his elbow. Escorts like seeds thrown into every sea lane. Hull numbers he does not recognize but understands. Anyway, steel in service of movement, movement in service of arrival, arrival in service of repetition. He thinks of the hours embedded in each of their own aircraft, hours of artisanship, and realizes that he has been counting the wrong currency. The ledger on his table records units of beauty. The ledger across the ocean records units of time. He returns to the contempt line for a last use. Crude American ships, he says it himself under his breath to try on the coat. The coat fits poorly. Crude is another way of saying the machine forgives rough handling. Crude is another way of saying a conscript can use it after a short lecture and a hot meal. Crude is another way of saying it will be there tomorrow and the day after and the day after that because someone designed away the urge to polish. The tremor stops while he writes down a figure that flatters craft a tight dispersion at a range that makes gunnery professors smile. The tremor returns when he writes the daily rate that crushes such smiles under a count of sorties that refuse to end. He can feel the betrayal not as a word, but as a physical event, a small loosening at the chest where faith sat. Precision did not lie to him, not exactly. It merely told the story it knew and omitted the one that mattered. He sets the pencil down and looks at his fingers until they calm. The hum comes back through the wall and settles into the furniture. He understands that the sound is not noise, but policy. He folds the graph and tucks it under the map. The ache that remains is not for ships or aircraft, but for an idea he carried like a compass. The idea had a smell fresh lacquer and warm metal, and a shape lines true enough to make a draftsman proud. He does not abandon it. He notes with the tenderness a man gives a broken tool that it cannot rule a world where time is made in bulk. He turns to the next page and writes a new unit in the margin. Not knots, not miles, not pounds, minutes multiplied. Dawn lifts like a sheet pulled back from a machine. Deck crews move at the speed of a practiced breath. Tractors nose into position, chocks grip fueling lines, kiss fittings without a waste motion. The plan moves from paper to body, and for a few minutes the world accepts it. Engines catch in an even stagger, one after another, exhaust plumes bending in the same direction as if someone had combed the air. Hayashi listens with his eyes closed and counts the rhythm against the line he drew last night. It matches. Precision feels like moral proof when it holds shape outside the mind. Aramaki checks fuses with a ritual he learned on a winter pier years ago. Thumb and forefinger a half twist, the lightest pressure to confirm the detent. The quick look for scoring or burr. He does not think about hands. Hands simply answer. The ordnance team advances down the row flags, rising and falling in a choreography that would embarrass a parade. A signalman on the island counts intervals and taps his board with a slate pencil. Sato turns the volume down on his set to keep the code from pricking holes in the music of the deck. Launch order slides forward in a curve that feels carved rather than written. The first line rolls, lifts banks like a hinge, becomes a stack of silhouettes in proper spacing. Lift by lift, wing by wing, the deck empties into the sky, and the sky accepts them with no complaint. Hayashi watches the second group taxi to the mark and hears an old teacher's voice tell him that elegance is more than beauty. It is economy married to purpose. For a breath or two, the war seems willing to be solved by that marriage. Turnaround begins while the last pair fades into glare. Fuel mules arrive as if tied to the wheels of the departing aircraft. Covers pull, caps, swing hoses, seat with a single shove, a single twist. The men who carry ammunition walk the same step they always walk, neither hurried nor slow, as if time itself were following their lead. Aramaki floats along the line, like a man inspecting calligraphy. He corrects a posture with two fingers on a shoulder. He rotates a fuse and listens with his bones for the click that tells him the thread is true. The click comes. The line moves. The clock on the island nods approval. The first reports from the strike ride home with the neatness of a ledger that balances itself. Hits scored. Columns of smoke standing to attention. Return fuel with intolerance. The deck gang receives the first recoveries with the same indifferent grace a train gives a familiar station. Hooks catch wheels, kiss hands catch wings, and lead them to where a pencil point would have placed them. The turn begins to show its second face, not simply a repeat, but a refinement. Timing compresses by seconds. Ground time shortens by thumb widths on Hayashi's ruler. Too perfect to help himself, he lets pride have a half second. The hum arrives as if it had been waiting for his permission. Not loud, not dramatic. A layer under the real noises, under the shouts and the clanks and the urgent shushes. A shipyard down the coast of another continent. A forest of cranes that never learned the word pause. It threads itself through his counting until he has to push it aside to hear the numbers again. Sato bumps the gain on his set, catches a fragment, in a flat voice about shift, change, and parts issued, and then the line wipes clean, replaced by rain on a roof that is not there. Aramaki leans in for another fuse check, and the tip of his forefinger does not land where his eye sends it. Only a hair's breadth off, but he knows his own body too well to excuse it. He draws a breath to quiet the small revolt and tries again. The detent gives not with the usual discreet agreement, but with a faint scratch, a suggestion that the thread argued back. He withdraws his hand and studies the little brass face as if it had insulted him. He turns his wrist, turns the piece to the light, sees nothing wrong, and feels the skin over his knuckles tighten. The next cut on the line is due in seconds. He reaches anyway, and this time the click sounds right, but there has been a tiny theft confidence. The first return of the day lands, long rolls to a stop, and the crew that should have been half a minute closer to ready is still 30 seconds away. Nothing visible. No collapse, no shouting. The loss is sensed the way a rower senses a current taking a finger width of speed. Another landing. Another roll. A hook skips, catches on the second try. The tractors still know their routes. The flags still rise and fall. But Hayashi's pulse, which had been a comfort, ticks faster by a barely counted beat, and the metronome of the plan needs his attention to stay audible. On the far net, the factory tone swells and recedes as if the other side had fitted the ocean itself with a pulley and a belt. He can almost write their day from the sound one line shifts to lunch, while the line beside it keeps feeding frames. A crate of magnetos moves from a truck to benches, where men do not look up when the camera passes. If one machine falters, another machine covers its absence. The airframes that broke this morning will be flying this afternoon under a different serial. The second wave assembles with stubborn elegance. Timing holds in most places, and in the places it slips, the men pull it back by will. Aramaki's hands go, sure then sure again, the way a man crosses a river on stones and occasionally tests the water with his toe. He hates the test because it makes the test necessary. He thinks against his own practice about how long he has been awake and how quickly his fingers will learn to fail if he permits them fear. He widens his stance, squares his shoulders, and insists on the ritual. The ritual mostly obeys. The deck gives all it can give, and the air collects the second wave as if it respects the effort. The sky fills the appointed lanes, and for a half-minute the ship feels like a moving box that every line inside supports. Then, the hum folds into a heavier image. He sees, without wanting to see it, the other side's field, where grounded aircraft gather in new rows before the smoke of the morning has thinned. He imagines a man with a clipboard who never doubts that replacements exist. He imagines a chief who swaps a whole engine because diagnosing it would take longer than lifting it. He imagines a tally board that refuses to go down to zero. Reports bleed back with a different temperature. Interceptors reappearing with an eagerness that does not make sense if the morning's damage had seared itself into the day. Flak that feels like a new layer, as if someone had refilled the barrels while the paint was still wet. The air above the target thickens. Precision still scores, but the enemy's sky does not remember that it was hurt an hour ago. It arrives new. It arrives supplied. It arrives on time. Hayashi writes numbers with a tidy hand and watches the tidy hand tremble at the end of the stroke. Not a quake, a smudge's worth of motion, the body confessing what the mind refuses to put into words. He draws the curve that should be dropping and sees it flatten, then creep upward. Availability has entered the chart. It does not need permission. Aramaki drops a fuse. Only a thumb's width to the deck, and caught before it can bruise a fin, but the sound lands in every skull within 10 paces, like a hammer against enamel. He picks it up and resets it, with a care that would look like prayer if seen from above. Sweat slides down his wrist and makes a dark line on the cartridge paint. He tells himself aloud to breathe, and hates that he had to hear his own voice to remember. The island clock keeps time. The plan keeps asking to be believed. The men keep giving it belief in the only currency they own, control of their own movements. The enemy spends time like water. The second wave begins its return, and the deck teams brace for the reception that always shows whether a day holds or leaks. The first of the group takes the wire clean, and the hands catch his wing with that practiced impersonal kindness. Someone shouts a number that means a change to the order. Someone else nods and moves 3 steps left. Everything still works. Sato raps his knuckle on the set and mouths a count. The hum, under the static, answers with that same indifferent confidence. Hayashi writes one more figure and understands in the way. A body understands a fall before the ground is reached. That discipline in this shape is a sacrifice offered to a clock he does not own. The deck hums, the aircraft hum, the factory hum answers from far away, and the 2 notes make a chord that does not flatter his ear. He sets the pencil down before his fingers can betray him, and in the pause between one launch and the next, he feels the trap-close brilliance that survives, only long enough to prove it exists, then drowns under hours, made somewhere he cannot touch. The deck breathes in patterns the men trust. Then, the pattern tears. It happens inside a fragment that Sato should have missed. He skims the band for traffic, and a slab of sound falls through the speaker like a crate from a crane. Not code, not voice. A rhythm with corners, air hammers, rivet guns, the clank of hooks taking steel by the ton, a whistle cut short, then 3 knocks in even time, then the raw cough of a compressor biting into its work. The room jolts as if the ship itself had taken a slow hit. Sato reaches for the dial. The sound grows teeth and eats his gesture. Hayashi's chest climbs for air and does not find it on the first try. The pencil leaves a black comma on the margin where it stops. The heart steady in fours all morning runs to a higher gear. He hears it in his ears. First, a soft drum that does not belong to the room. The shipyard cadence rides the static with a presence that crowds out argument. He can see it now without trying. Cranes turning like giant wrists, a team shouldering a plate into line, a man with a chalk marking the next weld while the last one still throws red light. An overseer checks a sheet on a clipboard and never slows his walk. Minutes carry weight there. They move like cargo. A runner appears at the hatch with the kind of face that leaks truth even when the mouth holds discipline. A pilot is down. A section leader reports heavier resistance than predicted. The morning confidence has not broken, but it has grown seams. Hayashi's breath shortens and stutters the body, choosing honesty before the mind will. He taps the map once in a spot no one else will notice, and the tap admits what the tongue still refuses to speak. He sees the oath like a script burned into bone. Never recommend a pause when the geometry is true. He tries to make the numbers draw the same conclusion they drew before dawn. They will not. They have not betrayed him. They have only matured. Lines that carried beauty at 6 show a different message at noon. The curve of sortie availability, which should roll like a wave shaped by the moon, takes a square edge. The turnaround clock, which should purr, starts to cough. Sato flinches at a new burst from the set. A clipped voice counts crates by the hundreds, pallets by the score names, an engine model as if it were bread. Forks squeal on concrete. A bell rings somewhere above the mic and stops mid-peal because a supervisor raised his hand. None of it says attack. All of it says return. Hayashi steadies his fingers by placing them flat on the table. The pulse under the skin tries to push his hand away from the wood. He pushes back. Aramaki steps into view below with a gesture that gives his state away. He wipes his palm on his trousers and does not know he did it. He is not failing. He is arriving at a place the plan did not map. The fuse line creeps forward and then hesitates when a man asks too politely for a second check. Hayashi watches the pause travel through 3 crews like a ripple that reveals the current's speed. Seconds. Small mean seconds that steal from the hour and profit by it. He summons the old teacher's voice again, economy married to purpose, to see if it still holds the power to lift the floor. It does not. A different voice answers dry and unadorned, keep the line moving. He realizes he has been arguing with a sentence whose author does not care whether it wins. It only repeats itself until repetition changes the shape of the field. He looks at the launch ladder, at the blocks of time he carved out of darkness, and sees that each relies on what the enemy refuses to grant, a breathing space between punches. The island clock gives up a minute with a proud tick. The tick sounds late. He hears his own breath, catch in his throat, hears the small rasp at the top of the inhale, the way a man hearing bad news forgets how lungs work. The choice is there with teeth in it. Press the plan forward and honor the oath, or spend lives to prove discipline can outshout a factory. He tries to delay the second he knows he must choose by writing one more figure. The figure is a lie the moment the graphite touches paper. He picks up the tube. The room notices in a silent way, bodies adjust without looking at him. He waits half a heartbeat longer than protocol permits in case a miracle walks through the door. None arrives. He gives the word he swore to deny. Hold. The word spreads outward through steel and rope and skin. It reaches the deck as a changed wind. Tractors break a fraction sooner. A man who would have trotted walks. A pilot who had his hand on the throttle eases it back and stares straight ahead, as if forward were a cliff he does not want to name. The ship does not stop. It learns a new gait that spends time differently. The radio's quiet, as if the room had been gagged with linen. The heart punishes him for the order by driving hard against the sternum. Breath comes in disassembled pieces that need reassembly before they pass. He meets Kuroda's stare across the table. The stare asks for a reason that does not shame them. He provides none. He provides only the absence of the next line in the plan. Kuroda looks down first, not out of respect, but to avoid saying a thing he would have to carry all his life. Sound floods back through the open door from the set in a smear of iron. Guns hammer, feed stops. Click a whistle, gives the third note of a scale, and is cut off again. The cadence shoves into the pause he ordered, and colonizes it. He sees the ugly brilliance of it, the way it eats every quiet. A craftsman needs to do his best work. He has not saved lives. He has denied the clock one of his own mistakes. It is a cheap victory and a necessary one. He lowers the tube and lets his hand fall to his side. The fingers shake, and then, angry at their own honesty, stop. He forces one full breath, then another. The body obeys on the third try. He writes 3 words in the margin where only he will see them later. The letters are plain and without ornament. Availability decides caliber. Something in him resists the syntax. He changes it on the next line to make the truth carry weight. Availability is the deciding caliber. The sentence settles without pride and makes a home in the map's white space. He touches the edge of the paper and feels the wax give under his thumb. Shame does not arrive as heat or nausea. It arrives as a coolness at the back of the neck, the sensation of standing in a draft that was always there but only now noticed. On the deck, the hold converts into ordered care. Checks lengthen by the width of a fingernail. Crews swap a cartridge they would have nursed into place yesterday. A pilot climbs down and takes water because fighting thirst is not noble when there is a flight to make. The men do not insult the order with visible relief. They do their jobs more slowly, where slowness becomes accuracy. They do them more quickly, where speed secures an aircraft without stealing attention from a human joint. They move with the dignity of people who know a truth that injured them and will serve anyway. The hum from the far coast recedes a little, or perhaps he stops granting it room inside his skull. It remains. That is the point. He does not need it to vanish. He needs to mark his life against it without lying. He pencils a new set of blocks on the board, lighter than the old ones, built with room for what he cannot change. Between 2 lines, he writes one small arithmetic that does not care about pride. Hours win battles when nobody steals them. Months win wars when somebody manufactures them. He sets the pencil down and looks at his hand a last time. It is steady. The oath is not dead. It has been edited by contact with the world. He gives the next instructions in a voice that belongs to the man who will be required tomorrow. The ship answers. The clock answers. The far coast answers. All 3 answer with the same lesson, and this time he does not argue with the teacher. The room is smaller after the order. Voices drop to the range that tools understand. Paper settles. The deck keeps its altered rhythm and leaves the air above the table clear enough to study something that had been waiting for him. Sato lays down a photograph and a bagged piece of metal recovered from a raft kit. The paper shows a workbench in harsh light, a component mounted on a stand with lines painted around the bolt heads to show motion. The bag holds a bracket with a part number stamped large enough to be read at arm's length. The thing is not pretty. The curves are generous. The edges are blunt. The finish is indifferent, a utility gray that invites dirty hands. He turns the bracket in his palm. It sits heavier than it looks, with ribs where a draftsman would have softened the transition. One hole carries a chamfer big enough to catch a bolt on a clumsy day. Another opening is slotted to accept an imprecise approach and still pull true under tension. The stamping is not a maker's pride mark. It is an address so that a tired corporal cannot mistake where the piece belongs. On the back, someone has painted the number again, larger in a hand that does not care whether the brush ran. He studies the photograph of the engine mount that part supports. Quick-release pins with rings big enough for gloved fingers. Clearance around each nut for a socket, without skinning knuckles. Wiring looms that run in ways that admit a lazy route and still keep out of harm. He looks for the insult and finds only intention. Overbuilt, so a mistake bends metal, but does not end flight. Fast to swap, so a diagnosis can be shortened to a decision without guilt. Kuroda comes to his shoulder and stands without comment. He knows enough to let the object speak. Hayashi uses the pencil to trace the path from pin to pin in the photograph. Here a man can stand awkward and still keep leverage. Here a mount can be broken and replaced at the shop door with 2 jacks and a winch. No ceremony, no priest. Kuroda breaks the quiet first, but he does not say the word crude. He watches Hayashi's hand and offers the older catechism as if to confirm whether it still belongs in the room. Precision earns time. Craft prevents waste. Perfection achieved once removes the need to repeat. Hayashi sets the bracket down and answers in the same tone their instructors used for range tables. Precision earns an hour if the field holds still. Craft prevents the waste of the first hour. Perfection that cannot repeat is a museum piece. He does not look up and does not turn his voice into apology. Doctrine that cannot repeat cannot decide. The sentence lands flat as iron and stays where it fell. No one corrects it. No one praises it. It becomes part of the furniture. He lists what the component implies. Every operation assumed a man would forget his gloves some mornings. Every fastener assumed an angle made clumsy by weather or urgency. Every edge assumed that a replacement in the rain is not a moral failure, but a service. The system forgives. Forgiveness, when multiplied, becomes endurance. The idea offends part of him, and yet his fingers keep agreeing as they test each surface for cues: pull here, a line there, seat until the shoulder says stop. Aramaki enters, without wiping his hands, and sees the bracket on the table. He smiles not at its beauty, but at the thought of it at 2 in the morning in bad light. He taps the wide ring of a pin in the photo. This does not ask for a lecture, he says. It asks for a hand and a minute. He does not realize he has used the word minute as a compliment. The talk folds inward to the day that began all days of this war. He opens the folder he keeps buried under maps, the one with the first raid's notes. He runs a finger down a list that still smells of wet ink in his memory. He stops at 2 lines he once skipped, as irrelevant to the pilot's art tank farms and yard capacity. He tells the room what he would have refused to say aloud yesterday. We hit ships, we hit aircraft, we hit men. We did not take the hours. The tanks stood after the smoke drifted. The yards woke after the shock. Time did not bleed. He frames it as the analysis that some planners are writing now in quiet, not as accusation, but as arithmetic. Kuroda nods, once a small concession paid to reality. Missing those targets did not subtract skill, he says. It left the weapon of time on the table. He does not use the word mistake. He uses the word remainder. Hayashi draws a box around the bracket's part number and writes a simple equation beside it. Replace in minutes beats, repair in hours, beats diagnosis in days. It is not a new thought in the abstract. It is new when a thing you can hold tells it to you without rhetoric. He adds another line he would have mocked last year. A component that welcomes clumsy hands increases the number of hands that can serve it. He knows what that implies about training and pride and the art he loves. He does not carve the implication into moral shape. He leaves it as a shop truth. Sato brings the maintenance pamphlet they have translated from intercepted copies. The pages are crowded with numbered drawings where a draftsman would have preferred one elegant cutaway. Each step has a box to tick. Each box has a line for a name. The procedures assume fatigue and rotate people through tasks to prevent it from deciding for them. It is pride-proof. It does not ask a craftsman to prove himself. It asks a line to move. He thinks of his own fleet's most perfect machines, each adjusted by a hand that knows its moods. He remembers the way a tuned engine rewards the tuner with a sound that no checklist could teach. He honors that feeling and also writes a tally that refuses to flatter it. If the enemy can restore 10 airframes while we nurse 2 into ideal health, the song our machines sing is an aria in a storm. He draws a single mark under the column called hours. He adds 9 more under months. He returns to the bracket for a last look before the day claims him again. He places it on the table as a symbol of what hurts and what must be accepted. It is not a betrayal of love to admit a rival's strength. It is a form of love to keep men alive by choosing what works when the sky refuses poetry. He turns to Kuroda and speaks doctrine without heat. We designed for the decisive hour and believed the hour would be enough. They designed for the month and built a way to buy more months. We will not out-argue a calendar. We must outlast it or alter it. Kuroda holds his gaze and does not object, which is assent in this language. Hayashi gathers the papers and slides the photograph into the folder with the first day's notes, as if to force the past and the lesson to sit together until they learn each other's faces. He leaves the bracket where he can touch it on the way to the door. A bell sounds on the deck, and the ship resumes its measured life. He answers in the only way that matters now. Adjust the cycle to the men we have. Conserve the skill we cannot replace. Spend hours where they grow into days. Deny the calendar whatever we can. He does not declare a new faith. He counts. He writes one more line at the bottom of the page to keep the mind from slipping back into preference when fatigue returns. The machine that flies again before noon has more doctrine in it than the one that is perfect at dusk. The ship settles into evening with the steadiness of a lathe. Men walk narrower paths. Paper weighs more. The bracket on the table keeps its place like a new law that no one voted for, but everyone obeys. Hayashi draws the last curve of the day and leaves a margin wide enough for a sentence he has been avoiding. Air tastes of cordite that drifted back from recoveries. The varnish smell has thinned. Steel holds the heat it took at noon and lets it go in a slow breath. He rewrites the ledger headings in the language a machine would prefer. Fuel becomes minutes airborne. Oil becomes hours between swaps. Spare engines become sorties restored. Deck cycles turn into a throughput figure that ignores pride and counts only arrivals and departures. The old frame of mind keeps trying to push through the door with its lacquered shoes and its sermon about decisive beauty. He lets it stand outside and listen. Sato brings a short stack of maintenance slips, each signed, each time stamped without drama. One page notes a swap, completed in the span of a cigarette. Another clocks, a fault isolated to a module and solved by trading it for a known good unit. None of the handwriting strives for elegance. The shapes exist to move a line forward. Hayashi underlines the minutes in each corner and connects them across the table until the pages look like a transit map. No artistry, only paths. Aramaki stops at the door and touches the bracket as if it were a charm against the old habit. He reports nothing the plan would call a triumph. He reports a day that did not erode as fast as it might have because checks took precedence over style and swaps outran diagnosis. He waits for approval and receives none, not because he failed, but because the language of credit has changed. The nod he gets counts as currency now. Kuroda remains the last defender of a music that trained them to believe a single perfect note could quiet a hall. He taps the chart where Hayashi has redrawn the cycle with deliberate slack. He calls the slack waste without saying the word. Hayashi answers with a ruler and a pencil. He lays the ruler across 2 days and marks where hours pool into days and where days stack into something heavier than any sortie list. Waste becomes investment when the calendar is the enemy. The ruler makes the case. The pencil enforces it. He writes the fused unit where labels used to go. Resource divided by time equals what a fleet can do tomorrow. A pilot is a resource. A carburetor is a resource. A man who can change both in the rain is a multiplier. He assigns a value to forgiveness inside a design and watches the line that measures availability climb by a fraction. The fraction is enough. Fractions multiplied across a month tilt a war. The critique that no one wanted to print finds a voice in the margin where only truth survives. A strike that left tanks full and yards awake preserved the enemy's calendar. Shock without starvation is spectacle. He writes it smaller than his pride and darker than his preference and lets the ink stand. Night machinery hums under the deck like a second tide. The radio's cool. The set breathes quieter. He takes the bracket in his hand for the last time and sets it back down as if returning a tool to the right drawer. He thinks of a classroom where a teacher once said that doctrine is a promise between mathematics and courage. He amends the promise without ceremony. Mathematics must include the clock. Courage must include the choice to repeat what works, even when it insults taste. He drafts tomorrow as a list of tolerances. He gives men room to be tired without letting fatigue pour into loss. He gives machines permission to be merely adequate if adequacy flies again before noon. He draws a new standard of victory that does not ask for applause. It asks for presence measured at closing time. The last light in the room cuts a clean wedge across the board. The numbers hold still long enough to be believed. He pulls a final line beneath the day and writes the truth that will survive him. Precision wins hours. Availability wins months. Months decide wars.